ash sifted through the broken sky like unseasonal snow, whispering over the dead stones of a city that had lost the memory of its own name. The red keep stood like a rib cage around a heart burnt hollow, and the wind laid hands on shattered lintels and hissed through corridors where kings had swaggered and queens had plotted, and a young girl once chased cats for practice. That same girl came now as a shadow, a quiet thing with a small blade and a narrow pulse, breathing slow because slow breath steadies hands. Arya Stark moved along a corridor that no longer had a roof. The sky above it was the color of coal washed ashore in a gray sea. The air tasted of lime dust and something old and metallic. The stair she climbed was cracked and flaking, the edges eaten as if by a hungry fire. She kept her feet light, the way the dancing master had taught her long ago, the way her feet had learned in the black and white house where footsteps meant human and breath meant mortal. Quiet as shadow, quick as a blink. She had waited for the screams to dwindle. Even a dragon's city grew quiet eventually, the living driven to holes and the dead to stillness. She had waited until unsullied patrols passed like narrow spears of men that cast no shadows of doubt, and until the Dothraki galloped themselves hoarse and fell at last to drinking and to telling each other in a language of iron laughter how it had been. She had waited and watched and learned which small doors no one guarded because the guard who knew them had become soot, and which passages a rat still loved, and how the wind rode its own path through the carcass of the Red Keep. She had told Jon, with her eyes and then with her mouth, that the woman who had done this could not be allowed to breathe air that belonged to the living. Jon had looked back with the hurt of a boy who had grown too big for the house that raised him. He had honor in his bones, and honor had led him to betray himself twice and perhaps a third time if someone didn't stop him. He was not for killing the woman he had loved, or the woman he felt bound to by something older than himself. He was not for killing his own blood. It had to be her. Arya tasted ash and old wine on the wind as she crept. She remembered a small girl with a strawberry tart in one hand, and she remembered a white horse pushing its soft nose against her palm in a street where the stones still smoked. The girl and the horse were both gone to wherever things go, but their absence sat in her ribs like two stones. The great doors of the throne hall had fallen open as if some careless god had scattered the hinges. A storm had blown ash inside to lie like snowdrifts across the floor. Where once a ceiling had held up a world of banners and pride, there was only the pale light of a dawn clawing its way through cloud. The iron chair at the far end had partly melted into a bench of slag and stubs, like the broken teeth of a dead thing. No one stood watch in this ruin. A conqueror had no need to watch the last of what she'd taken. Someone was already within. A slim figure in a long coat the color of night water, hair unbound, shoulders squared with that fierce, fragile certainty of someone living inside a dream and daring it to be real. Daenerys Targaryen walked along the line of drag marks where old swords had wept and pooled into black iron. She touched the stubs with her fingers and her face was all wonder and winter at once. She looked very young. She looked like a girl standing in a story she had been told as a child. She looked harmless. She was not. Arya did not come on straight feet. She kept to the side of the hall, slid behind a toppled pillar, waited when wind rattled a sheet of loose bronze somewhere above. No guards, no councillors. No chain around the queen's throat today, no whispering spider at her shoulder, no timid scholar, no silver-haired ladies with soft hands. The woman who had rained death on a city of bells wanted to touch her dream alone. Even murderers had private places. When Arya moved again, she moved like the memory of motion. She had the little dagger in her palm, its pommel cool, its blade a shard of night that remembered older murders. The knife had answered one kind of winter already. It might answer a fire now. She remembered the lesson that was not words, that all lives were one coin and all coins could be spent, and some were spent better than others. She remembered names she no longer said because the saying had become a kind of prayer she didn't believe in anymore. She remembered the smell of her father's cloak and the sound he made drawing breath to speak in a courtyard that was round, and she remembered the silence after. Daenerys set her palm on a bent spur of iron as if it were a railing on a balcony back in a house with a red door. The wind blew ash into her hair, and she closed her eyes and breathed it like a saint might breathe incense. Arya thought, "She is making a church out of what she burned." She is in love with her own miracle. She is a girl with kindling and a match, and she never learned how to stop. The floor groaned softly under Arya's foot. A piece of slag shifted, rang a brittle note. The queen's eyes opened. She turned half a head. Her mouth parted, a little question on it. Arya saw the angular line of cheekbone and the pale skin where tears might once have been. She saw the mouth that had spoken freedom like a blade and then had used a blade's meaning instead of its words. She saw a woman who had decided she was right for everyone. "Arya Stark of Winterfell," the queen said, softly, wonderingly, as if she were naming a character from a story she had read in a childhood her brother had ruined. She did not look frightened. She did not reach for a guard. There was no guard to reach for. Arya's arm knew the path. The body's best knowledge is the one it does not ask permission to use. She closed the distance with 2 steps, and the dagger slipped in under ribs where the bones made a letter like a cup to hold it. It slid the way a thought slides into certainty. There was very little blood at first, only a brighter wetness, and then the queen's breath was a soft "oh" of surprise, and the second breath tried to come and did not. Daenerys' hand lifted and touched Arya's wrist in simple astonishment, as you might touch a bird that had flown through a window by mistake. The queen's eyes were a color Arya had seen in a cold lake, and for a heartbeat they were not mad or merciless but very far away. Her mouth made a shape around something unsaid, something like a child's wish about a house and sunlight and the taste of fruit she had not seen since she was very small. Arya took her wrist away. She took the knife back with a shift of hand that made no second tearing and laid the queen down because it is cruel to let a body fall hard at the end. There was a sound then like the sea deciding it was done with restraint. Air moved. Ash rose, swirled, sank. A heat hit Arya's face before the flame. She smelled it as one smells summer lightning. The world in front of her became an opening jaw of fire. The dragon's scream was not like any sound an instrument could make. It was a grief that had found a mouth big enough. Arya stood with the knife dripping a thin thread, and for a breath there was nowhere to go and no time to go there. The fire came as if to unmake the act. It washed past her cheek. Her hair leapt and crackled. She saw the flame's core, blue-white, and felt it pull the moisture out of her eyes. She turned, took 2 steps that were more like falls, and threw herself behind the shoal of a fallen pillar. The marble steamed. The ash on the floor leapt up like swarming insects, then flattened again. Through the roar, she heard the thundering collapse of iron turned liquid. Heat forced itself into her mouth and down her throat. She tucked her face into her elbow and felt the old leather of her sleeve try to shrink away. Through a crack between 2 chunks of stone, she saw the dragon. He was black where he was not red, a moving mountain against a light brighter than day. His wings made thunder just by being wings. He did not fling flame now for seconds. He poured it, a river wide as the hall, not at her shadow but at the chair of dead kings. He ripped it with heat, unstitched it, burned the symbol until it was not a symbol anymore. The shards drooled to the floor and ran like black honey, and the dragon screamed again and then closed his mouth on grief and lowered that skull like a bell and nosed the queen. He knew she was dead. He must have known from the first. Dragons knew flame as wolves knew blood. He nosed her and whined in a terrible way, and Arya, crouched behind her stone, thought of Nymeria across a river of years and felt something crack in her chest. The dragon put a claw down with all the care of an old woman lifting a baby and gathered the body. The wind that his wings threw made the ash dance in spirals like ghost dancers. He turned his head once, and the slit of his eye found Arya's shadow through luck or some dragon sense that cared little for stones. He fixed her with that hot, hammered gold stare. She did not move. She held the queen's knife down and counted breaths in a city that had too few left to spend. The dragon did not burn her. He bellowed a sound the hall was too small to hold, surged, and broke whatever remained of a wall to make a doorway big enough for grief. He carried his queen away into a sky that took him because skies take everything in the end. Silence after flame is never empty. Stones settle like tired men lowering themselves to the floor. Iron cools with a hiss like a cat warning its offspring from the edge of a high place. In that fragile quiet, a boot scuffed on ash. Jon Snow came in with his face the color of the city. He stopped when he saw the slag, when he saw the footprints that were not queens or dragons, when he smelled the death that was recent and particular. His eyes went very old. He went forward as if some of him had already fallen and the rest had to follow. He found the outline in ash where a body had lain, and he looked up as if to find anywhere else for his sight to go. Arya shut her eyes. She slid out from behind the stone as if the shadow had decided to remember its owner. Jon saw her, and the first thing in his face was not accusation but a terrible softness, like a first winter snow that knows it will not last. He did not ask how. He knew how. "It's done," she said, because sometimes the only useful words were the true ones, and because she had said those words to herself as the blade went in, and she had to say them again now to make sure time had not lied. Jon stood in the wreckage of a throne and a story and a mourning. The light on his face was the sort of gray that makes the world honest. He reached out but did not touch her. He was not for touching any longer. "Go," he said. He meant more than the room. He meant the city. He meant the life that would swallow anyone left holding this moment. She wanted to tell him that there was no going that made anything simple. She wanted to tell him she had done it because he could not, and because she wanted to be the kind of person who did not let others do her hard things, and because she was still a wolf even if she had let herself be no one for a while, and wolves take down the thing that kills their pack. She wanted to say there would always be someone to cut in the dark, and she was tired of being the knife and the hand and the heart. She said none of that. She nodded and went. The corridor outside had filled with soldiers who did not know yet what had happened. Their faces were tight with habits built from discipline. Their spears were straight. They did not look at Arya. She was a small figure in a general ruin, a smudge in a world of smudges. She went down the stairs and turned into a passage that smelled of bat and salt and came out into a yard where the sun was still uncertain it deserved to rise. She walked across the yard because running draws eyes. She slid through a gap that children might have used once to escape a whipping. She put her palm on her belly to steady it because the body remembers afterwards what the mind forbids during. She did not weep. She had wept when she was young, and those tears had been very expensive and had paid for many lessons. By the time she reached the lower keep, the rumor had begun to move. Rumors move like fish. First one darts, then all of them turn at once, and suddenly the water is alive with direction. "The queen is dead," someone said in a voice that wanted to be whisper and failed. "A dragon has flown east with a body. The throne is a puddle. He killed her," said someone else, meaning whoever that someone needed to mean. No, another hissed it was witchcraft from the north. No, a Lannister trick. They're good at killing kings. No, the gods, the gods, the gods. She passed a group of unsullied moving at the trot. Their sandals made a sound like flat rain. Their faces were stones. She held a piece of broken pottery like a servant and kept her head down and her shoulders at the angle of someone who has to find water or be beaten. The habit fit. She had been a servant before. A soldier glanced at her and then threw her and moved on into his orders. She let him. When the shouts came up from the high yard, she already had her path chosen. She went out through a postern and down into the city itself. There were people moving in the streets now like mice when a hawk has flown on. They came out from under ruins and from the shadows of cart bodies and from the strange caves that toppled houses make. They carried water skins and wrapped bundles and babies with faces that belonged to no house and every house. Arya gave a woman her water skin and watched her drink. And when the woman passed it back, she saw the ring of a burn around the woman's wrist where a bracelet had become a brand and then a scar. They looked at each other. No words. Words were for other seasons. She found the street where she had once tried to shepherd a child with a smudge of ash on her cheek and the child's mother who had screamed until her throat was glass. The street was smaller now, narrower because the buildings had leaned in to whisper to each other about grief. The house with the tilting steps had gone to a greasy black on the cobbles, and the smell, there was something that would never leave the stones. Arya bowed her head because she could not do anything else worth doing in that place. She walked and put her hand without thinking on the hilt of needle and felt steadied by the iron that remembered her father's forge and her own stubbornness. The knife she had used she wrapped in a strip torn from her shirt and tucked at the small of her back under a layer of leather. It seemed smaller than it had a little while ago. Murder makes everything smaller except silence. The shout went through the city then like a banner being unfurled in a wind too strong for any hand. The queen is dead. The screams that followed that shout did not all sound like grief. Some sounded like air filling a chest after a long time held underwater. Some sounded like a sob that had lost the word to hang itself on. Up in the ruined hall, men found Jon. They found him because he did not hide. Grey Worm came, his face the face of a statue built out of instructions. He took what he saw and made it into duty because that was the only thing he knew how to make. He found ash with footprints and a melted throne, and he found that the dragon had taken the one body that might have told a story. He looked at Jon and his hand made a small gesture that belonged to someone who had once loved a woman on a warm island and had called her Missandei with the softness of a man who had a small place inside him where gentleness lived. Then he pointed and his soldiers took Jon's sword away and bound his hands not because he wanted to hurt him but because the world needed binding. Tyrion Lannister sat in chains, his mouth dry as last year's bread. He had not slept since he had seen the line of fire dragging itself across a city too slow to run. He had been brought to a small cell with light too bright for a man who had lost his god and his god's little bells. When they came to tell him, they did not tell him. They shouted it to someone else where the words could be overheard by anyone who needed to overhear them. He closed his eyes and thought about irony the way a man thinks about old wine he can no longer afford. "She did it too well," he said to the empty air, and the empty air made no clever answer because clever answers were the province of a life he did not want to live anymore. He thought of Jon, and he thought of the Unsullied, and he thought of blood. He thought of how close a ruin is to a kind of freedom if the right people are tired enough. The days that followed were days of edges and bargains. The Unsullied did not riot or rape or run. They tightened. The Dothraki cut a wedge into the countryside to take horses and women as if habit could save them from the present. Then were harried by northern outriders and silent trappers from the Vale who knew how to stack rocks across a path so a rider broke his neck in the dark. Davos moved between groups with a voice like a bridge. He spoke to men who remembered storms and to men who had only ever known deserts. He kept food going to mouths that would have screamed instead. Yara Greyjoy walked with a limp that gave her a rhythm no drummer would envy and talked about debts. Gendry Baratheon, who had been made a lord the way you put a crown on a tool and call it art, stood with his hands too big for the new words and did not pretend to be anything he wasn't, which is a kind of power men recognize when they're too tired to lie. Sansa came south before the dust had settled in the cracks. She came not as a sister but as a woman who had learned the price of chairs and the cost of rooms with locked doors. She came with riders whose faces were winter and a banner that had not burned because the gods had a sense of story. Bran came not at all. He arranged to be brought, and then was in a litter like a boat on the backs of men who had been woodsmen yesterday and were today the poles that pushed a river. Samwell Tarly came because he could not come, and because he believed that if he was not there to speak, the world might forget the sentence that suggested mercy. Brienne of Tarth came in a coat that had smoke on it and eyes that had salt, carrying a history heavy with men who had died inside her trust and outside it. Ser Davos said to a pensioner of the city watch, "I've had enough kings for 3 lives." And the man snarled a laugh that turned into a cough. They held a council because that is what you do when the world has been broken. You sit in a circle and pretend circles mean safety. The place was not a hall. Halls had burned. It was a yard where weeds had begun to invent themselves again between stones that once had seen rehearsed parades. The lords and ladies and the ones who were neither but had lived long enough to be asked anyway stood in clothes they had not chosen for ceremony and looked at each other as if each face were a knife being weighed. Grey Worm came with lines in his forehead that were not from frowning. They were from the sun. He stood at the edge of the circle with his hands behind his back because a soldier's hands are always somewhere usefully. He did not sit. His men stood behind him in a line that said more than speeches. Beside them stood men who had followed Jon into a night full of dead things and come out the other side, and men who had followed him across stretches of white so wide you lost the sound of your own heartbeat. If a war had wanted to happen, and it could have happened here, the air was thick with it like humidity before a summer storm. Tyrion came into the yard in his chains and did not tug at them because chains are not less real for being tugged. He looked like a man who had been told a joke he could not repeat. When they bade him speak, he spoke not because he thought words could do the heavy lifting, but because the world is a cart that will not roll if you do not put your shoulder to it and make the first inch. He spoke about stories because he understood that every kingdom is a story and every story is a kingdom made of breath. He said a thing about choice without using the word, and a thing about blood without drinking any, and he held Jon out as a problem and as a solution both. Grey Worm wanted the problem punished. Sansa wanted the solution protected. Yara wanted a promise she could take back to islands that were tired of mainland nonsense. Davos wanted ships to bring grain. The boy from the Vale wanted not to be mocked. Edmure Tully started to set his shoulders as if for a speech and found Sansa's eyes and sat back down like a man who had learned the relief of being told to keep quiet. "Who rules?" the Yard asked. It did not speak, but the question rose from the stones like the breath of the earth itself. Bran Stark's eyes were not always here. The birds were landing somewhere. The roots were drinking somewhere. He looked at people and they felt the weight of being seen by a thing that remembered winter in a way that flesh cannot. When Tyrion named him, he was naming not a boy or a crippled prince, but a patience most men can't hold in a single thought. Sansa raised her chin. She spoke plain about the North. She did not ask. She told. The old oaths had been burned with the old city. The North had kept a promise to a world that had not known how to keep itself. It would be a realm apart now, and if anyone cared for the reasons why, they could go to Winterfell and feel them in the stones. No one argued because there were still men in the Yard who had stood on a wall of ice and seen a storm given teeth. Yara narrowed her eyes but did not spit. The Prince of Dorne's soft hands, cool voice, a silent army behind his silence, smiled a small smile that did not quite reach anywheres. Gendry shifted, thought about lines on maps he had never drawn and never wanted to, and recognized that lines on maps are easier when someone else draws them. Grey Worm's voice was a blade dressed as a reed. "The man who killed the queen is ours," he said. "He will answer to us." He did not say how. He did not need to. He was a man who did what was in front of him until there was nothing in front of him left to do. It is a form of prayer. "You have no proof," Sansa said, and her voice was an arrow notched to a bow made of memory. "You have a man you wish to blame because it is easier than admitting that a woman died and the sky did not split open to tell us who did it. You have a need. We have a brother." Jon did not speak. He was brought forward and he looked at the faces of people who had loved him and people who had feared him and people who had hung their last hopes on his rough sense of duty like washing on a line. He met Grey Worm's eyes and did not look away because he had stood before things that made men forget their names. Tyrion said the words because someone had to. Exile and a wall and a service that was neither quite a jail nor quite a freedom. It was an old solution to a new mess. It was not justice and not vengeance and not mercy. It was a truce with the world. Grey Worm's mouth tightened. It tightened because the woman he loved was dead and the woman he had followed had died, and each had died with her head held high on a place of execution of different sorts. He had been made to bend several times in a life that had taught him bending was death. It is a difficult thing to do in public without breaking. "Let him go to the wall," Grey Worm said at last in a voice that had sand in it. "Then we will go where we are going." He did not say where. Everyone knew the word that meant where. A green island, a sanctuary with its own doom in the making. The Unsullied took orders from ghosts as well as from the living now, and one of those ghosts was a woman with a gentle mouth and a strong mind. The Yard breathed out. A king was called. A hand was forgiven enough to be shackled to duty. The North drew itself up like a young tree shaking off snow. A thin laugh rose from someone at the absurdity of it all and dried in the same mouth that had made it. The living began to take their seats in the story the dead had made room for. Arya did not attend that choosing. She watched from a place where the wall had cracked and a vine had dared a new green. She turned the little dagger in her palm the way one might turn a worry stone and tried not to count. When the council ended, she followed Jon in the way you follow a stream backwards to its spring. He had not been brought to the same cell they had used for Tyrion. No dignity attaches to coincidences like that, but to a place with a slit for light and a stool and a bucket. He sat on the stool with his hands loose in his lap. He lifted his head when she came like a man smelling rain after a long thirst. He showed his teeth in what might have been a smile if smiles had ever learned to grow in a place like this. "Little sister," he said. "Little wolf. Little knife." The words were not said. They hung in the air between them and were warm all the same. "I did it," Arya said. There was no point to pretending otherwise in this room. She told him in a simple voice how the woman had looked at the iron that had been a seat and how she had breathed ash as if it were memory. She told him about the dragon's scream and the heat on her face and the way fire can sometimes be a mercy to stone and not to flesh. She told him she had not run because there is nothing to be gained by running from the eyes of something that can fly. Jon closed his eyes the way a man does when he goes under the water to wash. He nodded once, and it was not the nod of a king or a commander but of a brother whose bones were tired and whose heart was older than he had thought he would live to feel. "I know," he said, and she did not ask whether he knew before or after, whether he had guessed in the hall when the world rang like a bell, whether he had felt her in the ash the way a wolf feels the word pack without needing the sound of it. She was glad he knew. She was not sorry. "I am to go north," he said, "to where there are fewer words." The corner of his mouth tilted in something not quite laughter. "I seem always to end where the world keeps its edges." "You will breathe," she said. "You'll watch the snow fall and it won't be ash. You'll look at the line where sky meets world and you'll know no one owns it." She saw it as she spoke. The clean white, the sound of boots crunching, the long blue afternoons. She saw a wolf trotting with her head high and the steam from Jon's mouth when he laughed because a small joke had warmed him, and she felt jealous, which made her smile because envy at last was proof there were still things that mattered. "And you?" he asked. He had the right. "West," she said. "I want to know what the map doesn't." She felt the word as a taste of salt. She felt a ship tilt under her feet and a rope burn callous into her palm. She felt a different kind of cold on her face, the clean kind made of wind and spray, not the kind kissed by death. "I don't think I can be in halls anymore, not as myself. I learned too many ways to stand behind someone unlooked for. I don't want to live in corners, waiting." He nodded again. "We have all been used by rooms," he said, and Arya thought of Sansa, whose beauty was a blade she had learned to hold at the safest end, and of Bran, whose eyes were a door that opened inwards to a place no one else could go. She thought of herself and the many faces she had put on like damp shirts and peeled off again. It would be good to live where there were no doors and no faces, only horizon. He leaned forward then and took her in his arms. It was a simple embrace, awkward as the first learning of dance. She was surprised at the heat of him. The world had been cold so long she had forgotten men were warm. His breath was in her hair. He spoke a thing without words into the top of her head. She put the knife back into its sheath when she left the cell and it felt light. She moved through the keep the way memory moves through a mind, softly and without permission. Sansa found her in a little courtyard where a bush had survived the fire by the simple trick of being dull and not worth burning. Her sister's hair caught what light there was and turned it to something redder than blood. They looked at each other and the years between their looking fell away like loose threads. "You did it," Sansa said. Arya made no motion that agreed or refused. The truth can be a privacy even among those we love. Sansa's mouth folded as if against a taste that could not be improved by salt. "He will go north," she said. "It is better than the other choices. It is not what I want for him. It is what we can have." "You will have a crown," Arya said, and then, because the word felt like something swallowed without chewing, she added, "You will have the work that is the crown, and that is the only work you were born to do." Sansa laughed once, softly, without mirth. "I was born to do needlework and bear sons of men who lied prettily," she said. "But I learned something better." She reached out then and clasped Arya's hand, the way girls do, and for a blink they were those girls again in a castle that had smelled of bread and clean hay. "Go find what's past the edge," she said. "Bring me back a story I haven't heard." Bran's goodbye was neither word nor look but the absence of both. He was already inside the trees and the birds and the slow, good dark of the wolf's den. Arya stood near him while he sat in a chair that had never once been a throne and felt something like a blessing pass between them. He turned his head very slightly, and for an instant his eyes were wholly here and wholly hers. A shadow of a smile touched his mouth. A strange, small thing that belonged to a boy who had once climbed places he had been told not to. Then he went away behind his face, and that was his way of love. Brienne came to her as she was strapping her pack, closed in a room with 3 walls and a view of a sky that the 4th wall would have once corrected. "I can give you a horse," Brienne said, as if she were offering bread. As if anything could make the road easier that was not the road itself. Arya shook her head and said the word ship with a small hunger she couldn't help. Brienne's mouth softened. "It suits you," she said, and then, "You will leave me behind." Arya heard the grief in that, not for herself but for some idea Brienne had carried about the world. That the good things stay, that once you have gathered them you can keep them. "We always leave each other," Arya said gently. On the morning Jon left his cell for the journey north, the sky had complicated itself with summer clouds, bright-bellied and lazy. He walked with a step that did not weigh. The unsullied ringed him without malice. He looked up once at the broken keep, and his face made a shape that was not quite bitterness. There were people in the yard who watched him with a love they might never spend. There were others who watched him because people watch anything that moves away. Grey Worm stood very straight and did not step forward. Their eyes met, and in that meeting there was a respect that had nothing to do with liking. Men who have walked inside rules recognize each other. Men who have given up all their choices in order to choose one thing except the cost in quiet. Davos had arranged a boat because Davos arranges boats with the same ease other men breathe. Jon went down to the water with a gait that remembered smaller boats, remembered oars, remembered a father who had not been his father, and a brother who had been, and a man who had been a father in all ways that count to a boy who needs one. The dock smelled like old fish and new hope. A gull cried because gulls always make a noise at ferrying. Jon turned once and found Arya in the crowd without looking for her. "Some creatures you always find." She lifted a hand in a brief, fierce salute. Warrior to warrior, blood to blood. He answered with a tilt of head that was almost shy, and then he went aboard without looking back again, because looking back is a habit that erodes resolve. They had kept ghost for him. The wolf came loping along the shore like a piece of the north taking a walk in the south. Ghost put his big head into Jon's hands, and Jon did not hold back this time. He buried his face in white fur that smelled of clean winter and listened to the low woof of a growl that was not warning but greeting. The wolf panted in his breath, and Jon laughed, a small, shocked sound as if laughter had ambushed him. The men on the dock looked aside because a man and his wolf are a private nation. The ship Arya chose was not fine. It was a working thing with scars in the rails and patches on the sail like knees on a child's trousers. The captain had eyes like a coin with one side rubbed smooth by many transactions and a tattoo of a fish whose tail had worn away in spots. He asked no questions because the shape of Arya's face told him she would offer no answers. He took her coin, which did not glitter but which he weighed in his palm the way a man weighs a future, and he told his mate to cast off. She stood at the prow because all girls who leave home stand at the prow at least once. The river took them with that familiar, stubborn pull, and the city slid back like a mood you decide not to have. The smell of char receded, replaced by the honest stink of tidal mud and weed. By the time the river widened into something that felt like choice, the sun had found its courage and laid a strip of brightness on the water that made it look young again. Behind her, men set ropes and checked knots and swore in the affectionate way sailors swear at things that have been with them longer than wives. A boy not much younger than she had been when she had chased cats came to coil a line and looked at her as if she were a kind of shore. She looked back and smiled without showing teeth, and the boy blushed in surprise that something so plain could be a gift. On the 3rd day, a storm considered them and then decided against it. It sent only a roll of water that lifted the ship's belly and dropped it again with a sound like a giant clearing its throat. Arya kept her feet. She had learned balance in the House of Shadows, and waves were only another kind of floor. She ate fish dried to a hardness that needed patience and bread that remembered better times. At night she lay in her narrow bunk and listened to the ship talk to itself and to the water, and she understood a thing she had not put into words before. That the world being bigger than her had stopped feeling like danger and started feeling like relief. Meanwhile, the city made itself new. It does not happen because a queen is dead. It happens because people move their hands. Masonry can be taught new tricks by men with hammers and no illusions. Women with baskets and ropes of hair push rubble into piles that will later be called foundations. Children find treasury in debris. A spoon, a coin, a scrap of color that becomes a flutter on a stick. The unsullied took their leave in a line as straight as an oath. They marched through a gate missing its teeth and did not look back at anything but one another. Their ships had sails the color of cloudy mornings. When the wind filled them, the men on the quay said nothing. Men who come home from war develop a respect for departures. Grey Worm watched the city recede as if he were counting instead of looking. He would go to a green place and try to find a way to set his spear down without it rolling back to his hand of its own will. If there were sickness there, they would learn it. If there were grace, they would deserve it. He thought of a woman on a wall who had not begged and felt for the first time that his ribs were cages for more than a single heart. Tyrion dressed himself in a title as you might put on a hair shirt, which is to say in full knowledge of what it is meant to do to a man. He spoke to builders and to widows and to men who carried water in buckets whose bottoms had been mended so often the original wood was a suggestion. He sat in rooms with bad light and made lists. He went to a quiet place with a book that had once been near kings and wrote a name in neat letters because a promise given to a dead man is not a promise you are allowed to break. He drank less. He slept at hours that were not the hours he liked, because the world had made its claim on him and he had decided to let it. Sansa stood in a hall where tapestries had been washed, widely and again, and took the measure of men who had decided she was to be measured by them. She wore a crown that did not glitter. It sat on her hair as if it had grown there. She spoke in a voice that had learned when to warm and when to chill and when to stay exactly the temperature the listener least preferred. She remembered the names of girls who brought bread at the third hour because girls who bring bread later become women who keep books, and you want those women to remember how you said their names when they were small. Brienne kept her oath in ways that shifted slowly the way a river shifts a bank. She trained boys with shoulders still soft. She trained girls whose hands were chapped but whose eyes did not lower. She sharpened a sword and then another and then put the stone aside and took up a quill. She wrote the history of a man who had broken her heart in the same way steel breaks. Not into fragments but into a new shape that can make something useful of itself. She wrote kind when it would have been satisfying to write true and harsh, and she wrote true when the truth honored the man he had tried to be at the end. In the South, a crippled king rolled through rooms where the light was filtered by curtains that had survived because silk sometimes does. He listened to men who had learned to speak again after being taught to shout. He moved pieces on a board that looked like a game and was not one. He looked at ravens with the same expression he had once saved for snow falling on a branch. He allowed himself to be managed by a man who had once mocked him and now would die of managing. When the king turned his eyes on a map, the lines felt seen. The Dothraki did not like the quiet. They pushed into the Riverlands until the Riverlands pushed back not with a charge but with fences and ditches and a cleverness that stole horses at night and then left jars of grain in their place so that men woke confused and unwilling to call it theft. They went east at last because east was the direction their tongues remembered. They took with them stories about a city that could burn and about a little shadow that had cut a queen in her own hall. They told that story 50 different ways around 50 different fires, and each of those ways was truer to the teller than any truth written in a book. North of the wall, the air spoke in the old language of cold and sun and wind through trees. Jon passed under the broken arch where once the Night's Watch had called men to a discipline that tasted of soot and noble intentions. The gate was a mouth missing teeth. He went out with Ghost beside him and a small, watchful people falling in around him because men who have carried you once across a wilderness are very ready to do it again. Tormund yelled his name like it was the last ale in a long drought, clapped him so hard on the shoulder a lesser man would have bruised, and then did not talk for a while because there are friendships that prefer silence to noise. They walked. The days were a series of small, useful motions. Take down the tent, tie up the bundles, check the shoes, strip the meat, lay it on the rack, drink, sleep, wake, laugh at a joke about a bear that had learned manners. Between those motions came the moments in which men remember why they are alive. A sky like the inside of an abalone shell at dawn. A fox lifting its paw delicately to place it in a track of its own making. A child running in a coat too big. Jon stood sometimes with his hands on a ridgepole and felt a happiness so simple it embarrassed him. In her ship, Arya found that the horizon is a creature that loves to play. It runs from you with a grin and then comes up to kiss your feet when you're not looking. She learned the name sailors give the same wind on different days. She learned to tie a knot with her eyes shut and to judge a squall from the color of a cloud's belly. She taught the boy who had blushed how to throw a knife into a swinging bale, and he hooped like a man who has just learned there are more ways to eat than he had supposed. They saw whales. The first time, Arya did not know what she was looking at. The sea breathed, and in that breath there was a blackness that was alive in a way the rest of the black was not. A spine rolled like a hill, and a pillar of white rose into the air and fell back as diamonds. The captain cleared his throat like a man saluting an elder. The boy crossed himself in the manner of his mother. Arya grinned. The world is so full of things that do not care for your little stories and will not change for them, and if you love that, you are finally safe. One night, when the water was flat as hammered lead and the stars spilled themselves without complaint, Arya climbed to the forepeak and looked west. A trader from a far harbor had told them about islands that moved and rocks that sang and fish that lit themselves on fire, and the crew laughed in the way of men who have traveled enough to know that mockery is a superstitious charm. Arya listened and kept her questions to herself. She did not need stories to be true in order to love them. She needed only to be moving toward where they lived. Days braided into weeks. The shape of land at last rose like a rumor too stubborn to die. It was not the crisp, familiar shoreline of charts. It was a low, mist-wrapped smear that smelled of things growing. The water changed color near it, grew greener, as if it had been staring at the land too long in a mirror. The crew spoke softly as they closed. Men who live by edge and weather grow superstitions like skin. The shore itself, when it arrived under their keel, was toothless and damp, a place where reeds had an opinion. Birds went up in clouds and scolded them. The air tasted fresh as an apple left in a barrel all winter. Arya leapt down into water that lapped at her boots and laughed because it was cold and because her heart was jumping as if it had found something to chase. She went up on a strip of sand and turned and saw a fox printed there in the tide line, and it looked at her and sat back on its haunches. She bowed to it because her manners were odd and would remain so, and it blinked and then ran, and she ran too for the joy of running, inland until the ship was a noise like a memory, and the green was so green it felt like an affront to the part of her that knew winter as law. Behind her, the captain had lit a pipe and was telling the boy to watch the sky because the sky tells you when you are not wanted. Ahead, Arya found a stand of trees with bark that peeled in scrolls and leaves that were shaped like fish. She touched them the way a child touches new clothes. She found a stream with water that raced as if late to its own wedding. She drank from it and did not die. She followed it until it widened around a stone that had cracked it into two thoughts and then joined again beyond. She sat on that stone and let the sound clean her head. When she rose and started back, she moved as she had always moved, in balance, listening for things that lived with teeth. She found instead a footprint human and bare. She crouched. The foot was small and light and had laid itself on the mud with delight or with curiosity. It had not been trying to be quiet. She followed it because that is what she does. It led her along a stretch where the reeds arched, then out onto a patch of earth that had been recently fussed over by someone with a stick. A ring of stones made a place where a fire had been and a half-gnawed bone told of eating. Arya smiled because once again the world was telling her a story and assuming her clever enough to take the point. She heard the voice before she saw the person. It was singing. The song had no words she knew and no tune she could hold on to. It went up when she thought it would go down and looped back on itself like a river with no ambition to arrive. When the singer stepped into sight, Arya did not move. The girl was perhaps 12. Her skin had the brown of a place where the sun is not mean and the wind is considerate. Her hair was a cloud tied back with a string. Her eyes were the exact color of the water in the stream where it pooled in the shade. She had a knife at her hip that had been made from something not iron. Arya could not place it and was delighted by her own ignorance. They looked at each other. The girl said something in her own language. Arya said hello because you may as well begin there. She kept her hands open and low. The girl smiled because tone is international and posture is universal, and Arya had managed to sound like a person who does not intend harm. The girl spoke again, slower, as if that changed languages. Arya cocked her head and said her name, and then pointed at herself and said it again. The girl copied the point and said a word that might have been her own name or might have been what her people call anyone who arrives strangely. Arya tried it on her tongue. The girl laughed. They were both very pleased. For a long time they traded things. A way to make fire from a stalk with a core that wanted very badly to be ember. A trick with a knife that made a cut no wider than a hair. A song that asked birds to ignore you. Arya taught the girl how to set a snare with a bent sapling and her own hair instead of rope, because rope runs out and hair does not if you are patient. The girl taught Arya how to read a sky that seemed new but was only the same old thing wearing a new hat. They learned each other's words for water and for hunger and for sister. They laughed because laughter is a boat that crosses between without paying a toll. When she returned to the ship, Arya brought a handful of leaves that tasted like lemon and lit up the whole tongue. And the men on board barked in appreciation and put them in a stew that had been waiting all its life for exactly that. The captain watched her over his pipe and nodded to himself, because the world has a way of putting people where they can be useful if they have the habit of being useful wherever they are. She slept that night with the smell of new earth in her hair and dreamed of the trunk of an old tree with eyes in it that wept sap, and then of a hall full of dead iron. She woke before dawn with her hand on the knife and then relaxed as the bird on the rail rehearsed its morning opinion. News does not travel to the ends of maps as quickly as it travels along the lines men draw in offices and call borders, but it travels. In taverns with roofs that used to be wagon canvas, and in halls that used to be barns, and in circles around fire pits at the very rim of where people bothered to settle, someone would say sooner or later, "The queen burned a city," and then someone burned the queen. Another someone would ask who did it, and the first someone would roll his eyes because there were 15 answers and none of them had managed to stop men from working the next day. In the telling that stuck, it was a girl with a blade quick as a wink, a girl with long hair, a wraith, a wolf. In the telling that had to be made in rooms where everything depends on what you can prove, it was a man with a face the world loved because it could not stand to hate it. John in the north learned his day by the way the light came through canvas. He taught a boy to set a bone right and laughed when the boy did it better than he had. He taught a girl to take a thrust on a shield without snapping her own wrist like a branch, and she taught him to swear in her language at caribou that would not be herded by mere logic. He walked farther than he had walked at any one time since the world had been remade, and found a valley that had not been called anything by anyone he knew. He named it in his head and then did not say it aloud, because names are a trap as well as a spell, and some places deserve privacy. At night he sat with Ghost's head heavy on his thigh and told no one a story in which he broke open and leaked out an old vow. Sansa sat in a seat that was not a throne but which people looked at as if it were, and in that looking the seat was made. She brokered with merchants who had learned to say please, and with old houses who had learned to say we are sorry without understanding what they were sorry for. She sent boys and girls to places where they would do well rather than places where their uncles wished them to be, and the uncles stopped complaining when those boys and girls sent back silver and had the good manners to pretend it had been the uncle's idea. She sat by the weirwood and said nothing to it, because that is how you pray to gods that do not answer with voices. Tyrion learned the art of getting good men to do small things well and bad men to do big things only when watched very carefully. He learned the names of brickmakers and midwives. He made soup when the cook fell ill in the middle of the day and was pleased with himself for remembering to taste before salting. He woke sweating some nights and reached for a cup that was not there, and then smiled in the dark because the hand that had reached did not want a cup after all. It wanted a different sort of comfort, and he was learning the trick of comforting himself with the memory of a woman who had not betrayed him and the knowledge that he had chosen to live. Brienne wrote another page. The ink bled a little where the quill cut the paper. She frowned, then let it be. Perfection is a vanity the living cannot afford for long. She watched Podrick spar with two boys and saw them both grin when he tapped their swords with his own and made a noise like a bell, a token at once affectionate and instructive. She put the quill down and picked up her sword. Habit is a form of prayer, too. Arya's ship found other shores and some held people. Some held only birds and rocks that declared themselves loudly when the tide scolded them. On one, the sand was black as the inside of an iron pot, and the water was so clear you could count the spines on a fish from the deck. On another, the sun did not set properly. It rolled along the horizon like a drunk searching his bed, and then changed its mind and climbed again. On a third, there were ruins with a shape to them that prickled the back of Arya's neck, and on that island the girl with the stream-colored eyes might have had cousins long, long ago. She walked there carefully and found a carving so old the stone had forgotten its own name, and she traced it with her finger and said to it very quietly, "I do not want to wear your face." Sometimes at night she took the little dagger out and looked at it, and sometimes she did not. When she did, she felt nothing like pride and nothing like horror. She felt the steady knowing that the knife had done what was asked of it, and that knives do not have to be forgiven for being knives. She thought about seeing Daenerys close, about the sudden childlike startlement and the way death had made the queen ordinary. It had not made her smaller. Death never does. It had made her true. There were days when the wind failed entirely and the sea lay like glass and the sails went slack and the men played at dice and made lazy insults and slept in the shade of their own size. On those days Arya felt a small itch under the skin because rest is a skill and she had not practiced it enough. On one such day, she built a small city out of pebble towers along the gunwale and then knocked it into the water with her thumb and watched the ripples meet and cancel, meet and amplify, until there were none. She had killed and she had made. She had loved and she had left. She had eaten the crusts of a life and found them good. She lay back then and let the deck be her earth and the sky be her roof and the sea be her moat, and felt that she was in a castle not even dragons could burn. Once, a bird with a broken wing came down out of a bad sky and landed on the deck in a slither of panic. The boy went to it with both hands out like someone catching a falling loaf. He held it against his chest and it thumped and then quieted. Its eyes were black and uninsulted by pain. They set the wing crude with a slat of driftwood and rag. Arya fed it bits of fish smaller than her thumbnail. She told it stories while it shivered under a box to keep it safe from the worst wind. She told it about a girl who had saved a city by stealing a name. She told it about wolves who do not live well in cages and yet will walk beside you if you ask them in the correct dialect of silence. When the bird took to the air again and did not fall, the crew cheered like boys and old men, which in truth they were. In a village brown with weather and clean with laughter where they set in at last for longer than a day, Arya learned the dance they did at dusk. It was a dance that had no intention of displaying the body, only of reminding it it was pleased to have been made. She danced it with a woman older than her mother would have been, and with a child whose hair stuck up like thistle, and with a man whose hands smelled of fish guts and salt. She found that her feet remembered joy as well as murder. She slept under a roof of thatch and rain laid its old drum on it, and she dreamed nothing at all and woke to the smell of soup and found herself happy. She wrote a letter she would never send, measured carefully so if someday a raven learned to fly sideways and in zigzags it would not tire, and she put it in the bottom of her pack, and it said simple things, that the world is large enough for our griefs and our grace both, that I miss the way Winterfell smells after snow, that I have learned to eat raw oysters and do not hate it, that there are voices here that would make you put your head to the ground to hear them better, that I am not someone else and never was. She put it away and then forgot it for a long time, and that was also a kind of prayer. The years began to set. Jon found a place where the northern lights did a trick with the sky that made even Tormund shut his mouth to watch. He stood with Ghost and listened to the crackle of a cold so intense it made its own voice. He closed his eyes and thanked no one in particular for letting him outlive his own story. Sansa cut her hair in a practical shape, and men wrote songs that described it like flame because even when men learn better they still sometimes sing badly. She did not correct them. She learned to ride out in storms and to eat when she had no appetite and to leave the room when she was tired so she did not say something sharp at the wrong time and cut someone who did not deserve cutting. Tyrion went gray in a way that suited him. He found he had the love of a certain kind of dog and the toleration of a certain kind of cat, and he considered those high honors. He sat once on a bench at dusk and watched children throw a ball and laughed harder than the joke warranted because he had not expected to live to see children do anything as ordinary as tire themselves to bed. Brienne took an apprentice who did not remind her of anyone except a better version of the apprentice herself would have been if the world had been kinder. Davos bought a house with a roof that shed rain properly and a small garden that stooped to be tended by old knees. He made 2 mistakes with the peas and ate them anyway in a stew and pronounced it an education. In the places where the edge of the world is only a word, Arya learned a patience that was not waiting but listening. She met 2 sisters who had never seen snow and taught them to throw a knife well enough to skin a fish without ruining the meat. And when she left, they gave her a bracelet woven from a grass that grows once every 7 years, and she wore it until it fell apart in her hand and did not mourn it when it did. She stood once on a cliff that faced nothing but light and water and the sound of both. And she said the names she no longer fought not to say, one by one, not to make them bleed again but to kiss them goodbye. When she said her father's name, the wind lifted her hair and laid it back smooth as if a big hand had done it. When she said the name of the woman she had killed, the sea lifted and the wave that came in was larger, and she laughed because the world did not scold her and because she had not asked it to. When she came back east on a current that had its own ideas about timetables, the city had roofs again. You could recognize the Red Keep not by its wounds but by the stubbornness that held it up despite them. The throne was still a story told for the shock of it, but chairs were again being made and sat upon, which is in the end the point of carpentry. There was a boy sweeping a step who had the look in his eye of someone adding numbers in his head for fun. There was an old woman selling pears with a knife that looked like one Arya had once carried for the specific purpose of not starving. She bought a pear and ate it, and it was not perfect, but it was good enough to be called something like summer. She did not stay. She sent a message north by a courier who looked like he would not drink it on the way. It said nothing that would make a man stop in his tasks and stare out the door, but when it reached Winterfell and Sansa opened it, she smiled in a manner the servants would talk about for 3 days. When Jon, farther north, heard from a man of the free folks who had been as far south as it is worth going that there was a girl with hair like night who had taught his niece a way to flick a fish onto the bank with 2 fingers, he laughed out loud and Ghost pricked his ears and offered his side for a scratch, and Jon obliged with both hands. Arya stood on a deck and watched a whale sound and thought, "We do not belong to what we did. We belong to what we do next." She turned her face into the salt and the wind and opened her eyes so the sting would make them water not from grief but from life. A boy ran along the deck with a rope and nearly tripped and righted himself, and she reached out, steadying him with 2 fingers at the elbow, light as the end of a feather, and he grinned up at her with teeth too big for his mouth and a future that would quietly insist upon itself. Far to the north, snow fell on a quiet clearing where a man and a wolf walked without fear. A fire showed a small domesticated son. A pot hung, steaming, offering a promise that the present could also be kind. The man looked up at the stars and found the one he had taught himself to use for bearing and nodded to it because old friends deserve acknowledgement, however distant they pretend to be. He thought about a girl with a blade and a boat and a hunger for horror. Isons. He knew she was alive in the way a man knows the season by the smell of the air. In a great hall of the north, a woman who had been taught how to weep quietly and how to laugh publicly and how to do both things honestly sat with a stack of petitions and a cup of something that steamed and tasted like a future in which children would have time to be foolish. She wrote down 3 names in her own hand for the first 3 girls who would be taught to read in a village that had forsworn the idea, and then she put down the quill and rubbed the ink off her finger with the pad of her thumb and looked at the fire and let herself, alone, be tired. After a while, not too long, she rose and went back to the work that was the crown. On the sea, the wind shifted. Sails bellied. The ship leaned a little as if bowing towards something it respected. Arya steadied her stance without thinking and grinned in the direction the prow pointed. The world had no edge. That was the entire solace of it. She had killed a queen and kept her soul. She had loved a family and let them each go to their own ending. She had seen a dragon's grief and not been burned for it. She had eaten pears that were adequate and found them excellent because she had been hungry enough to understand adequacy is a kind of mercy. She had a dagger in her belt and a rope in her hand and a sky full of choices. The waves came, as they will, infinitely, offering repetition until meaning grows out of pattern. She accepted the offer. She moved forward. She did not look back. The sun lay down a path of hammered light and the ship showed its ribs to it, rising, dipping, breathing. Arya stood where the wood came to a point and watched the west, not because she thought something waited there to meet her, but because wanting is a good wind and she had learned to use whatever wind she had. The captain said they would steer for the place where the water turned the color of a bruise, and the birds scolded them in a language even the sailors did not pretend to understand. She nodded and wrapped the rope around her hand twice and felt the sting that reminds you a rope has its own name for skin. The boy who had blushed had learned not to. He had grown into his sea legs and the habit of not dying in sudden squalls. He came now with a tin cup and held it out without words, and she drank because the day was hot enough to make salt on men's shirts and because kindness deserves to be accepted before it gets taught not to ask. When she passed the cup back, he kept his eyes on the horizon as she did, as if, by looking together, they could share the weight of distance. They reached the place of bruise water at dusk. It swelled with a sickness that was not illness, a trembling under the surface like breath being held. The captain made a sign, not the southern one but a curl of fingers his own father might have used at the moment when a gamble looks like wisdom from one angle and folly from most. The sea went glassy and then shuddered and then burst into small, frantic wavelets that skittered outward in rings. "A mountain moving," the mate said. His voice was not afraid. It was the tone a man uses on hearing news that fits too neatly with the story he tells himself about the world. They saw nothing but water and air doing their tricks, and then a slab lifted itself by a hand nobody could see. It came up gray and broad and covered in slick weed and the leavings of years. It sighed as it rose, then tilted. Waves slapped their hull. The ship heeled and recovered. The smell that arrived was younger than rot, the raw smell of inside earth exposed before it has learned to speak to air. Arya grinned because she loved tricks, even ones played by stone. The captain chewed his pipe and did not spit, perhaps out of respect. They threaded the place where the new island announced itself by showing teeth just under the skin of the sea. "Pumice," the mate said, and when the boy asked, he explained with 3 words and a shrug that meant, "Rock that floats now and doesn't later, keep an eye on it." They pushed off lumps with poles and laughed when one stubborn piece tried to come aboard as if intent on signing the book. Night came down with a soft hand and a hard rule, and they took in sail and let the world spin under them while the stars took attendance. Arya lay with the deck a hand's breadth under her and felt the way the ship translated wind into passage and thought. Everything worth doing is like this, a loud, patient compromise between desire and physics. In the morning they found birds in a crowd to the southwest, and the captain, who trusted birds more than maps, turned his wheel a finger's width. By noon there was a line, not quite land but the idea of land given scent and perspective. By evening they had anchored in the lee of a bay where mangroves fingered the water and dragons, real ones, did not exist, but the insects had ambitions big enough for a sainthood. The boy slapped at his neck, then remembered to look instead and plucked the thing away calmly. Arya laughed and he rolled his eyes, and after she had turned away he smiled, because it is good to be seen doing a thing you once did poorly and doing it well now. They went ashore with the tide still on the make. The muck made a sound that would be embarrassing if muffled by walls. In the open air it was only honest. Her boots were chosen to hate this, and they did. She let them. The air had a weight to it that northern lungs call story and southern lungs call home. The captain stayed by the dinghy because the captain's first habit is counting. The mate, whose second habit was curiosity, came with her as far as a palm that had learned to grow bent, because bending is how you keep your head above water when the world insists. The boy followed, as boys will always follow someone who looks at horizons with conviction. They found huts on stilts and fish drying on racks and women with arms strong from pulling nets and a dog with one ear and no patience for strangers. The people came out as if drawn by a bell you couldn't hear if you weren't meant to. They were neither startled nor gracious. They were correct. Arya had learned to admire correctness. She put her hands where they could be read and said hello in 3 languages, one of them her own, one of them the rough market tongue of 1,000 ports, and one of them a version of the girl's river speech she had kept in her mouth like a seed. A man older than the mangrove looked at her and clicked his tongue and reached under a raft and pulled up a basket with fruit that looked like bats and tasted like luck. They ate together standing up because chairs are a luxury and luxuries make strangers. When the boy impressed them with a trick of making a knot that undid itself with a slap, their faces softened. The old man tapped his chest and said a name that meant, as far as Arya could tell, the place where the river forgets to be river and becomes mouth. She tried it and he shook his head and laughed and tried hers and did a bad job of it, and they were friends, which is the virtue of names when used properly. They traded hooks for a recipe and knives for a story about a storm that had come twice in one day, because wind sometimes doubles back to sea if you survived it. 3 days there, and in that time Arya learned the trick of walking on planks that had never once been asked to be straight. She went with the women to a place where the mangroves opened into sky and watched them call fish into a net by beating water with paddles in a rhythm that sounded like scolding. She went hunting with 2 boys who could track a crab by a hole that looked like every other hole. At night, they told her that stars make nets as well as stories, and that if you watch long enough the nets empty themselves of their catch and the gods laugh. She did not argue. The gods, if they cared, could accept her nod along with theirs. On the last morning, a girl took her to a tree whose roots had braided themselves around a stone face, and the tree had one. The face was old, the oldness that has forgotten being carved and imagines itself to have grown. It had no eyes, only hollows where the idea of eyes had lived. The mouth was a crack. Arya set her palm on the root and felt a coolness rise like breath up her arm. She had stood before faces others had cut and bled. She had dreamed under leaves that listened and answered with a crow's shrug. This tree had no leaves like that, no red to whisper in, and yet there was the sense of something being attended to. "We do not cut it," the girl said in her language, which Arya now heard in her head like water. "We teach our children not to climb it. When you are mean, your mother says the tree will see." Arya smiled and did not weep and did not pray and did not write a name in her mind on its bark, because she had learned there are kinds of respect that do not require turning everything into your own story. When they cast off, the old man put the bat fruit in their boat without being asked, because you do not sell to those who have listened well. You feed them and trust the world to bring you more fish for your net. The boy lifted his hand and the girl lifted hers, and the boat slid backward with the smooth efficiency of practiced farewell. Offshore, the captain made a note with his pipe stem on a chart that would bear only his own eyes, and Arya looked west again and found itself looking back, and the comfort in this made her heart quicken like a horse seeing open ground. Far north of where maps pretend the world stops, Jon learned the new quiet. It was not the quiet that precedes violence. It was the quiet that accepts work. He rose when the light made itself into a blade that slipped under the edge of the tent. Ghost lifted his head as if he were attached by accords to Jon's breathing, and then set it back down when he judged there was no immediate need to be magnificent. Tormund swore about his hip before he got both feet inside his trousers, and then swore affectionately about the fire being lazy. A child, one of Craster's girls grown stout and red-cheeked and fierce with kneading and being kneaded, filled a pot and set it on a trivet and called the pot names until it boiled. They moved that day toward a valley Jon had seen from a ridge in a light that made every rock a decision. The snow in that place had pulled back like a tired fighter. Under it something green had made a rule. The free folk did not trust rules that grew that suddenly in places that had learned a different gospel, but they trusted Jon when he said, "There will be rabbits here and willow and perhaps enough soil to try barley if the summer bothers to come properly." They sighed because barley is work and work is a word no song can make charming, and they went because they were tired of undone hunger. On the way they passed the place where a fir had fallen for its own reasons, not a storm's. The roots stood up like a hand splayed in warning. Jon put his palm against the swirl and felt the ground's cold. It thrilled him. He had loved warmth and he had loved cold, and each had been a mistress with convincing arms. He turned his head at a sound and saw a line of musk oxen working their shaggy bodies down a slope, and the baffled magnificence of a fox who had clearly expected the trail to be his for at least an hour more. He smiled and did not tell anyone. Sometimes it is good to keep a fox's vanity private. The new valley held a stream that did not freeze because stones had arranged themselves cleverly under it. The first night there a boy lost his boot in the mud and swore himself into a man. The second day a man who had preferred pointing others at jobs found his hands competent around a spade, and was seen later coughing alone near the scrub with tears on his face because competence is a religion you never knew you wanted to believe. The third day they put up the poles of the first longhouse, and Jon stepped back and drew a line in the air with his finger because he had learned this trick from builders in a city that was acres of ash and needed drawings to prevent despair from dictating where walls go. Sometimes stones. They found them half buried on a little rise where the wind had taught the grasses to bow. There were 6 of them, round, their faces worn to some approximation of the human a god might sketch on a bored afternoon. Tormund spat, because there are things a man from the edges of the world knows better than to take lightly. Old or older than old, he said. The boy who had lost his boot placed his fingers on one, and then jerked them away as if he had been impolite and caught at it. Jon stood with them and did what he had learned to do in the presence of things that deserved reverence. He stayed. He did not press his mind toward them as Bran had once pressed his mind through bark and wing. He did not have that permission. He was content to borrow the silence the stones had already made. They went on. They cut and built and scolded the weather. The children learned both the ways of huts and the ways of tents and did not find it strange that a place could be both home and not home. Jon slept well often enough to remind his muscles what their job had been made to be. Ghost grew into a steady white presence to the children. The children learned to underfeed adoration with the discipline that keeps a wolf from eating a lamb for the joy of practice. Jon laughed when a boy of 8 declared solemnly that he was going to marry Ghost when he was older, and no one corrected him. The world would. In the nights Jon told no one a story about a queen who had not burned him, and sometimes he woke with tears and sometimes he did not, and both were correct. South, where the cold and the heat used calendars to organize themselves, Sansa sat with her palm flat on a parchment that said, "Half the boats that left White Harbor did not return before the ice took them. How will we eat if your pretty roads don't put bread on tables?" It was a petty, honest missive from a man who had lived long enough to spend all his patience and now had only a few coins of fear left to jingle. She lifted her head and felt the draft that demonstrated why she had insisted on a mason's time over a tapestry. "Stone keeps you alive more reliably than beauty. We need glass," she said aloud. 2 women in the room looked up because they had been taught to look up when the queen says a word that can be changed into a job. "Greenhouses," Sansa said, and did not use that word because it was not their word. "The gardens that hold the sun in winter. We will build them where the wind comes least, and we will hire men who can do clever things with smoke. Lord Manderley has sand good enough for clear panes. He thinks glass is only for beads and bottles. He will learn better." They learned. They built frames in the lee of walls and skinned them with oiled cloth until the glass came, and then they cut the glass wrong twice and right the 3rd time and swore they had meant to learn to do it like that. They planted hardy greens whose seeds had slept for years in bags, waiting for a queen to say the word that is not so but hope. Women in shawls took off the shawls inside rooms warm enough to make cheeks bloom and laughed at the foolishness of their own comfort. Sansa walked there and chapped her hands on purpose so when she spoke to men who chapped theirs it would not be only metaphor. She received a raven that said, "The islands do not wish to pay your tolls unless you can promise their daughters will not be stolen from their beds by the next set of men who call themselves lords." It was frank. She smiled because frankness saves time. She wrote in reply, "I will send women with knives and laws with teeth. I will send you a weaver who can show you how to make nets that do not let the small slip through. I will send salt and take salt and we will call it even." Yara read and nodded, and when her people tested the knives they were not disappointed, and when they tested the laws they were, and then they were taught how to read the second kind of knife and to use it. Brienne read a page in the book and frowned because the ink had bled again, and then she made peace with it because reaching perfection is less noble than reaching the girl who needs to learn how to parry with a weapon bigger than her wrist. Podrick made a joke he had earned the right to make, and the girl laughed without breaking stance. He approved. Brienne led a small escort to bring a cart of seed to a village that had been called by a name a drunk had invented and had accepted it with a shrug. On the road, a knot of men stepped out with scarves over their noses and blades that had last seen oil under a different king. Brienne saw the way one man held his weapon and knew he had once been better than this. She set her horse forward and spoke as if she were commanding an exercise. "There are 3 of you who can be taught to stop doing this. Drop your knives, keep your hands you write with, and take the seed in the back, but carry it the other way with us. You can steal it and get chased, or you can pretend you meant to be hired today and we will not insult your acting. Two laughed in surprise and threw down their knives as if throwing down a burden. The third tried to make a sound with his blade and then thought better of it. They walked with the cart, and by evening they had done a day's work, and by morning they had decided not to run because they had been given a job before being given a scolding. Brienne rode on and did not look back because she had learned mercy is easier to maintain if you don't insist on supervising it. In King's Landing, where dust found its way into everything like an overfamiliar neighbor, Tyrion stood looking at a square of ground where the chair had once lifted a story into height. It was a rubble that had learned to be humble. He had insisted that nothing taller than a man's reach be built there for a while. He had argued with a guildmaster who made arches for a living and fancied himself a poet with stone as his rhyme. "No," Tyrion said, "not yet. Let there be space. Let there be a place a child can run without being told to watch his feet." The guildmaster sniffed and named an arch from a city Tyrion had once, in another life, admired. "You can build your arch across a canal that needs one," Tyrion said. "The only thing that needs covering here is our instinct to pretend we deserve something beautiful for free." The man left, muttering about dwarfs with opinions. Tyrion went and found a tinker and paid him to make bells that would not ring loud enough to startle a horse but would ring loud enough to be heard if closed eyes were involved. He hung them on a frame and did not put a plaque there to say why. People came and rang them and cried and then stood and watched other people ring them and not cry and felt less alone for the difference. Bronn visited once, counting the stones as if they were coin and the coin as if it were stones. He had done well by doing little nobly and much shamelessly, and the city had learned to live with this contradiction the way you live with an uncle who eats loudly and pays generously. "You could charge people to ring those bells," Bronn said. His tone suggested amusement rather than instruction. "I could," Tyrion said, "but then I'd have to listen to them complain when they couldn't afford to cry." Bronn snorted and clapped his back with a hand the size of some people's faces. "We're getting old," he said. "You more cleverly than me." Tyrion smiled, not without sadness. "I intend to get older yet," he said. "It seems greedy, given how many people did not, but it's a greed I'll allow myself." Samwell Tarly, who had put on the color of the office and still carried in him the boy who sniffled but kept going, came with a sheaf of pages under his arm. He set them down and the dust leaped up in protest and then settled as if even dust knows when it is being asked to behave around a better class of paper. "A school," Sam said, as if announcing a child and waiting to see if the room would smile. "Where?" Tyrion said. "Not up the hill," Sam said, "or the boys will feel small again before breakfast. In the market quarter, near the blacksmiths and the women who brew. If the smell of yeast and hot iron can't make a boy want to learn letters, nothing will." Tyrion looked at him and felt a small, ridiculous affection near tears. "We'll build it," he said, "and we'll hire a woman who scares boys into being proud of learning. And we'll make it so the doors are wide enough to make the foolish think it's easy. Then we'll keep them with soup when letters fail." And west, always west, Arya found the end of the long blue reach and the beginning of a coast that slept curled under blankets of mist. The rocks were dark as old bread crust and twice as honest. The trees were of a sort she had not seen since she had been small, except these had learned new tricks about salt air and holding their leaves in winds that had never met a wall. They found a harbor made by two cliffs agreeing to disagree. The captain judged it safe with a professional squint and a slow draw of breath and then set to with the work of arriving. Arya's feet itched to be on the ground. She kept them still in the way she had learned to keep her breath still in a room where the wrong breath had meant a knife. They went ashore into a quiet that was not neglect but attention. She felt it like hands on her back and chest. On the cliff face, streaks of white showed where seabirds had written their own letters in the chalk of their right to be loud. The path up stuttered along in carved steps older than any of them. At the top it flattened into a meadow that tried to be scrub and then lost interest. There, arranged with a care that came from more than neatness, were stones. Not statues of men, not faces either. Pillars the height of a man whose base had been set into a precise slit in the earth with a patient mallet. Their surfaces were smooth, not by polish but by being asked to host the weather without complaint for long enough to be worn into acceptance. Each had a notch 2/3 up, and through these notches ran lines of ironwood, connecting them into a rope bridge of land. Between pillars, strands of something hung like the oldest harp in the world. When the wind moved, it made a sound you would have to have lived here to trust. A hum, deep and constant as a big cat's purr. The boy stood with his mouth open and then shut it because the music went through his teeth and he was afraid they would vibrate out. Arya put her palm flat to one pillar and felt the song in her bones. They did not see the people at first. Then they were simply there, as if the wind had taken pity on the stranger and decided to show her what she was asking. They were neither tall nor short, with the thick muscles of those who work with rope and water. Their faces were not closed to her, nor were they open. They were careful. One woman, her hair held back by a plaited band, lifted a hand in greeting. Arya lifted hers and let herself be read as someone who had learned to be read properly. The woman pointed at the pillars and said a word. She said it again, slower. Arya listened. The word, if you held it in the mind, meant not the things themselves but the thing they did. It meant to hold and to let go, both bound into one gesture. They treated the ship kindly. They brought fruits that the captain tried not to make a face at and then decided he had been wrong all his life about what sweetness was for. They brought a fish that had died with dignity and tasted of clean water. They did not hide their children. They merely kept hold of them as if a hand is an easy leash that can be made into a bracelet at a second's notice. Arya asked questions with her eyebrows and her hands and her patience and learned that this place had a name that sounded like a sigh turned sideways and it meant the first of the last, which she understood, because all edges are only the edge you happen to be standing on. They kept the harp strands mended because when a storm came, and storms did with the stubbornness of relatives, the sound told them things it did not tell strangers. The timbre changed when the wind carried ice. It changed when fish drove east in a panic about something with a mouth too greedy to be ignored. It changed when a ship had been clumsy nowhere near enough to hear their scolding but near enough to be found if a boat left now. Arya stood with them, then, and put her ear to a pillar and pretended she knew what they knew. She did not, but the pretending felt like a courtesy paid to the world. On the third day there, a child went missing because children do not understand the weight of names like Edge and Safe. The mother did not scream. She became taller with the effort of not screaming. The people moved not as bees do, chaotically and beautifully, but like a school of fish, each taking a line that made a larger line. Arya did not announce herself. She took a place on the cliff path where a boy might have been lured by the sudden increase of sky and went down it with feet that felt their way faster than eyes. She found him at the third bend, huddled under a shelf of rock where the wind had fooled the water into pretending to be calm, so a child could be fooled into stepping out and then be shocked by the truth. He looked up with his mouth in the shape of a complaint. She reached and handled him not as if he were fragile, but as if he were a perfectly good object in danger of becoming lost. He clung to her as if she were an opinion he'd just decided to adopt for a while. She carried him up because the long climb is not a place for teaching. When the mother took him with hands that had not been idle since he had become missing, the people sang a short, hard song that ended so abruptly it felt like a good slap. The boy made a face and then laughed through tears. Arya stood back and let her breath come and go. That night, they gave a feast that involved a fish stew the color of sunset and a bread that had learned to be patient in its baking. A man banged on a drum that had never seen a soldier. A woman sang in a register Arya's throat envied. Someone handed Arya a flute carved from the bone of a creature that had died of old age and respect, and she tried 3 notes that would have embarrassed her in other company. Here they were accepted as a conversation started late and in earnest. The boy, who had recovered enough to be vain, performed the knot that undoes with a slap for the 14th time and received applause as if it were the first. She asked the woman with the banded hair whether they had stories about what lay beyond them to the west. The woman smiled in the way all story keepers do, which is to say with a slight apology for how long this might take. She told of a place where the sea rises to meet a sky so low you must lie down to pass through, and of another where water becomes white stones for a day each summer and then melts back to truth, and of a third where men who came in ships were so proud they and their ships both were turned into birds and scolded their descendants from the cliffs. Arya laughed because pride punished by humor is her favorite kind. The woman shrugged. "There is west," she said. and Arya nodded as if she had been given a map rather than a direction. In Noth, the air held a sweet at the back of the throat that the Unsullied learned to fear. Their bodies remembered lines and distances. They did not know how to measure the small, bright creatures that came out at dusk and made men cough in ways that got worse before a clever woman fetched a leaf and boiled it and told him to drink. Grey Worm learned the names of plants in a language that hid its grammar behind kindness. He learned that the trick is not to fight fevers with ferocity but to build a system around them that catches men before they fall. He learned to instruct men who had been instructed to die to instead sleep and keep sleeping until the sweat eased. At first they buried too many. He set his spear down to dig because there is work that only hands can do to convince a man he is still in the world. He watched the women of the island sing to babies and to old men and to rivers and to graves. He thought of a woman who had laughed in a room full of enemies and decided that if he could not give her the kind of vengeance the world enjoys, he could give her this: a cohort of men learning to live where they did not hate living. He planted trees because the islanders told him the trees would make the insects lazy. This was not how soldiers think, but he learned it. 2 years passed and the men no longer moved like a single blade. They moved like a field of grass, obeying wind and rain and their own rootedness. He woke one morning with a lump in his throat and took a walk to see if it was the beginning of a fever. It was not. It was the beginning of something else, pleasing and humiliating to a man raised to think of pleasure as a horse that flings you only to make you crawl back on. He went to the river and tasted his own tears and found them ordinary. He laughed once and did not apologize to the woman washing a pot near him, who lifted one eyebrow and did not stop her scrubbing. They ate fish that night with a spice that had learned subtlety through fire. He set his spear where he could reach it with the back of his hand without looking. He did not touch it. He slept. In the king's city, Tyrion approved a tax on ale drunk within a stone's throw of the bells because grief is thirsty and can be asked to pay a penny so that the water flows in a neighborhood that forgot it had pipes. He listened to a man argue that the city did not require lamps on every corner because the moon will do, and he answered, "The moon charges." And the man blinked and said "Ah" and signed the paper. He stood with Davos and watched a ship come in with a cargo of grain and a captain whose ledger kept itself in the sloppy, contemptible way of men who imagine the gods will do their math for them. Davos did not scold. He taught the man 3 tricks of keeping accounts in a storm and charged him a promise to teach a boy to keep numbers on his fingers until his fingers wanted something better. The man, startled to find himself educated rather than fined, did both. A girl of 12 came to the square with the bells and rang one as if testing its balance. It answered with a sound like forgiveness slowed down. She stood with her eyes closed a full minute, motionless as a prayer on a lip. When she opened them, her mouth shaped a thanks to no one and everyone. Tyrion, watching from a place men rarely noticed, swallowed a gulp that had nothing to do with wine. He thought of his brother and of a woman with hair like wheat and of another with hair like hard words dressed like kindness. He thought of a day a river had carried him like a stick and he had dared it to put him down. It had. He went back to his desk and signed 3 papers that would irritate 2 lords and feed 100 unseen mouths and rubbed his eyes and laughed when a fly tried to share his ink. In the north, Sansa stood before a set of numbers and the men who hated them. "It is not that the south is taking your grain," she said, and smiled because it felt good to tell the kind of truth that pierces without hurting. "It is that the south is paying you for what you had forgotten you were good at. The road we laid last summer is not a theft. It is a spine. Spines carry. You have more than you can eat now because your sons need work for the months when the ice sits and thinks. We will make barrels here and sell the barrels south with the grain and then sell the grain in the barrels further still. You will complain and you will make money. You will say the queen is soft and then buy your wife a shawl and call it a comfort the gods sent." The men glanced at each other, caught in the embarrassing act of being seen. One grinned, another grumbled. All of them went away to tell their brothers they had been clever in the queen's presence. She went to the godswood and put her hand to the bark that had memory in it and said nothing, as always. A leaf fell on her shoulder. She smiled, ridiculous and alone. Arya had once told her, in a small room with too much winter in it, that the gods hear lies as politely as they hear truth and make of each what they can. Sansa declined to test them with either. She made her own, smaller gods. Bread that rose even when the day had gone poorly. Boots that kept water out. A girl who dared read a page her uncle said was not meant to be read by anyone so pretty. She returned to her desk, and that was prayer enough. Arya left the place of harp pillars with a coil of rope made by hands that had measured wind for 100 years. The captain did not ask what she had been given. He had learned not to inventory the gifts of people his ship had no right to expect kindness from. They shaped a course that was not a course in any book. The boy learned to hold a new star on the starboard shroud and to ignore the urge to taste every fruit offered on every shore. He failed sometimes and paid with his stomach and his dignity. Arya watched him lose both and helped him find them again without comment, because shame is a thing you can strip off a person by pretending it is not there. They met a sea lion that had found a plank and decided to adopt it. The captain decided to adopt the sea lion. The sea lion, with the generous selfishness of its kind, decided to adopt the boy. The boy learned to smell a storm in the way the animal's whiskers twitched, and Tyrion would have been pleased with the way a city boy grew into a reliable witness for the weather. The sea lion left as suddenly as it had come, because that is the arrangement you have with wild things. The boy watched it go and did not cry, and that was also a lesson. A storm did come, one that had not signed any agreements about seasons or patience. It rose from 3 horizons at once in a mood. The sky went a color full of iron and judgment. The ship groaned the way wood does when asked to be wet and wind bent too long. Men moved as if their bodies had agreed that fear is to be indulged only if it makes you faster. Arya took her place where she would be most useful. Not where heroism could preen, not where children watched, but where a rope, if let go at the wrong moment, would end a man. She wrapped it around her waist and leaned back into the pull with the calm of someone who had seen bigger things than wind and refused to be impressed. It blew and blew. The captain bellowed and then did not, because he realized he was making the men tired of listening, and men need ears more than bosses in weather this stubborn. The mast tipped enough to show them sky they were not supposed to see. The deck poured water out of itself like a beast with an injury. The boy lost his footing and would have gone into the night if Arya had not had the rope around her waist and a promise in her hands about not letting boys die on her watch. She took the load and felt the jolt up her spine and turned it into a sideways step and a call that was not a scream, because screaming is what you do when there is time. The boy swung and hit a post, and a tooth left his mouth, and he did not care, because his mouth was still a mouth and his life was still a life. The storm tried to be God and failed because the ship had too much practice being stubborn. In the morning the world lay down flat and pretended it had not tried anything. Arya shook out her hands, and the rope print on her waist made an ugly necklace. The boy slept with a rag in his cheek and his hand open on his chest like a priest's. The captain walked the deck like a man giving thanks without using words. The mate named new cracks with the kind of affectionate insult that keeps men and wood together. Arya climbed to the forepeak and watched the rim of the world breathe. She laughed once. The sound snatched away so quickly she wondered if anyone had heard even the idea of it. She dreamed that night of a room without a ceiling and a chair made of swords that had melted into a puddle that could drown the unwise, and of a woman's hand touching hers in astonishment, and of a dragon crying with a grief that had a mouth. She woke without moving and kept her eyes closed and let the grief pass over her like a wave. And when it had gone, she opened them and saw stars arranged in patterns that were new, and that was the only prayer she had any use for now. Seasons turned. In the north, a little boy in furs too plentiful for his own patience ran into the longhouse with cheeks bright as cherries and declared that the ice had made music when he stamped on it. His mother took him by the elbow and told him the ice also breaks, and he pretended to listen. Jon watched and thought of boys in other halls with other rules and thanked no god for being in a place where the only law that mattered now was the one that said, "Keep each other." He went out into the dawn, and Ghost walked beside him as if drawn with the same ink. He checked traps and brought back nothing, and then later brought back something and felt the same pride, because the doing is the thing and the outcome is only extra. He saw on a ridge a shadow that was not a deer and not a man. It watched him as mice watch. He watched it as a man watches the weather, a thing you respect without believing it cares about you. It was gone when he blinked because the world enjoys reminding you not to presume intimacy. He went back and shared soup and mended a boot and taught a girl how to notch an arrow so it would not break her glove when she loosed in the cold. And when the wind rose, he put his back to it and smiled because this is what he had chosen. Not a crow's duty, not a king's theater, but a man's day. Sansa sent south, to the boy who called himself Lord of Storm's End and sometimes remembered to live up to both words. Gendry came with his hair looking as if a forge had laughed at it, and his hands respectable with new wealth. He was awkward in the way of men who are not practicing at it. She liked him because of that. They spoke of roads and trade, and he surprised her with smart questions about axle grease and grit like sand that eats up wheels when you are not in the habit of telling your people to sweep. You learned, she said. He shrugged. You can marry a title and then lay about, or you can marry a place and find yourself fetching water with the girls because someone needs to. She smiled. You will do, she said. He laughed. I am not applying, he said. You haven't the hips to like me. She laughed at the crudeness because it had a kind soul under it and because it was good to be spoken to as a person and not only a crown for a minute. The small council grew itself into competence by the steady pressure of Tyrion's ability to look disappointed without becoming cruel. Bronn tried to siphon coin and was caught by a ledger that had been taught to bite. He returned the money with an apology that masqueraded as a joke and went out to inspect a border fortification that did not need inspecting until you realized the men there had started to believe they were forgotten. He drank their beer and miscounted their arrows on purpose and left a small purse for the man whose wife had a limp and a pride too big to accept gifts. Davos got the ferries working as if his heart had been waiting to be asked to care about the quiet miracle of men and women crossing a river safely for copper. Sam installed a girl in a chair to teach, and stood by the door as men came to complain. He listened and let them spill their fear and then asked them to read a word off a slate and watch them soften when they could, and he softened with them because mocking never built anything that lasted. Arya found a current that knew her better than most men do. It took her fingers and led her around storms as if they were arguments worth avoiding. She discovered an island where the sand sang when you scuffed your boot, the note high and silly and oddly heartbreaking. She discovered a bay where whales came to teach their calves how to breach, and the mother's huge patience made the world feel rightly ordered. She discovered in herself a desire to not be clever sometimes, to let strangers see that the knife she wore was not always metaphor. She showed it bluntly to a man who thought the boat would be his if he were only bold. He went away wiser and less likely to be stabbed later because she had taught him the difference between pride and hunger without making a speech about it. On a morning that had the clean blue of a polished thing, she woke to a smell she had not known she missed. Pine resin warming in sun. The shore had gone geologic again, rising into slopes with trees that pointed like men do when they know something you should. They anchored in a cove where the water was so clear the reflection of the sky argued with the depth in a soothing voice. She went ashore with the captain and the boy and walked into a forest that had decided on order centuries ago and had accepted its own rules. The hush, there was a listening. She felt watched and was not afraid. She had known being watched by worse. They found, at a bend where a stream had been teased into singing by stones too smart to be rocks, a ring of stones set into the ground in a pattern that had once meant something and still did. In its center, growing without explanation other than the world's appetite for delight, was a tree whose bark ran pale where others were red and brown and whose leaves shivered in the slightest wind with a sound of speech. Arya did not move closer than the ring allowed. The captain breathed in and out as if counting, and the boy took off his cap because taking off a cap when a sacred thing arrives is instinct older than manners. She stood there until the light changed. She did not imagine faces. She did not ask for anything. She said the name she had put away once, tenderly, as one takes out cloth that will tear if handled with anything but love. She included the woman she had killed and the dragon who had not killed her and her father and a boy who had danced and a man who had been a wolf for a while and then a man and both times had been hers. The leaves moved because that is what leaves do in a wind. She felt something ease in the socket of her shoulder, the place where a rope had taken its pound of flesh. She let that be the answer because asking more is greed. She left without plucking a leaf for a keepsake because you do not pluck from strangers who have taught you something. On the way back to the ship, She heard the captain exhale in a way that said he had been holding his breath since his father was born and had just found a good place to set it down. The boy scuffed his boot and the sand sang and the world laughed with him, small and sufficient. It was at a ragged harbor where a cliff had decided to try becoming steps, and only half had that she received a letter that had crossed from a city. Men insist on giving names to this far and a country where snow is a god's handwriting. It had traveled wrong ways and been read aloud to men with fish guts on their hands and to women with bread under their nails, and been said once by a child who could not read but remembered the sound of it enough to ask someone to write it down again. It reached her at last, crumpled as affection and smelling of smoke. It said in Sansa's hand that had learned to look like iron when it needed to and like linen when it could. There will be a school for girls in every village that can protect one with laws and one with neighbors. The roads have begun to be roads and not holes. The greenhouses bloom. Men laugh and then pretend they didn't. Bran sent a raven that flew without rest and then rested without complaint. You are beyond where I can send a messenger, and that is correct. Come home when you wish and not before. Send nothing but yourself if you return. If you do not, that is also an ending I will be clever enough to be proud of. She held the letter a long time without reading it again, the way one holds a hot bowl and lets its warmth teach the hands their own heat. She did send something, though, a little stone, smooth, with a hole in it made by water's long insistence. In the corners where girls whisper to each other the names of the boys they will not marry and the work they will do instead. Such stones are called luck. She sent it to Winterfell with a trader who looked like he kept promises and could count days. When Sansa held it up and looked through the hole at her own hand and laughed because it made her fingers look both farther away and closer, the women in the room smiled invisibly, because a queen being pleased by small things is a sign that large things will be managed. On Noth, the butterflies came and did not kill as many as before. The men had learned to cover their skin at dusk and to rub a paste into their hair that was green and smelled like old tea. Grey Worm stood at the edge of a field and watched the islanders teach his men to plant something that would be a tree his grandchildren could rest under if he had grandchildren, which he would not, and that was a grief he had made his peace with by building grandchildren for the island in the form of a well and a school and a rule that said, "No man with a spear may take a fruit until the children have had theirs." He tasted a sweetness and did not reach for his spear for the pleasure of feeling it. He reached for it to move it aside to make room for a bucket. He found that he liked the weight of buckets. King's Landing sent a ship there with bolts of cloth and tools and no soldiers. The captain came ashore with his hat in his hand, as if he were about to ask to dance with a stranger's wife. Grey Worm considered being stern because it was the only face he trusted not to make mistakes for him. He found himself being kind instead, because the men who had come were men who had learned there was more profit in selling rope to a place that had discovered it like tying nets than in selling swords anywhere. He took their measure and found it adequate and sat with them in a cooling afternoon while the islanders sang a song that meant, "The worst is not the end. It is a set of instructions you can ignore if enough people join hands and choose to forget it." Time did not stop to admire any of them. It never does. It did pause often enough to let them rest their chins on their hands and look out at the place where their work had made small differences. A roof tight in rain. A boy rid of fever by the leaf taught to a soldier by a woman who had grown up with trees. A ship loaded with barrels that would not burst because a girl in the north had taught other girls to measure twice and then ignore the man who said measuring is for men. A wolf old and pleased sleeping with his nose on his paws on a day free of alarms. A king who sat with a raven and did not move for an hour while the bird pecked the ink off his finger, and in that stillness 3 storms were watched and deflected with a thought sent to a man who did not know he had a thought not his own. Near a place where the world pretends to be empty because it is tired of being asked to hold men and their stories, Arya came to a city that was not a city yet. It was a crescent of huts and stone and intention. A people with hair braided in patterns that announced jokes and kinship and grief took her in because her boat had brought salt and iron and news. She taught 3 boys how to fix a net with their teeth when their hands were busy and taught a girl to throw a knife so it turned once and then twice and then made a decision. The girl swore and then did it and then laughed so loudly the hut learned the sound. Arya went to the edge where the tide threw up driftwood that some days pretended to be ships and watched a line that was not quite a storm decide to be nothing. It was there a man found her who had sailed from the east with a face weathered into handsome the way rope weathers into useful. He knew her family's name because he had once mended oars for White Harbor men, and because gossip moves even when the sea is in a foul mood. He said half the world had a different story about how the queen had died, and each story served the person telling it. He said Jon Snow had been seen at the edge of a wood with a wolf and a girl on his shoulders who wasn't his, and this was good news because sometimes the best fathers are people who aren't. She felt the news like a cup of water after a climb. She did not ask further. She did not need the details. The bulk of the truth was enough to put in the pack and carry a long way. That night she did not take the dagger out. She took needle instead and ran through the old steps on a strand of wet sand where her feet told her what stones were under and where the water helped with the landing. Advance, retreat, pivot, trust, feint, truth again. A gull watched solemnly and pretended to learn. She finished with the move that had been hers, the one a girl had used to end winter once, and felt it go through her without bringing cold. She slid the sword home and sat, folding at the hips rather than the heart, and watched the sky do the trick with colors that no king can own. She thought, I have been the story and I have been the space around it. I have been no one and Arya, and sometimes both. I can let the world move without asking me to be its knife. And then, because thinking anything too firmly makes the gods bored, she stood and went to eat stew with shells in it that clicked against her teeth and were a pleasure to suck clean. Letters came to her more often now, borne by men who had learned to sail the west like a wide river. Sansa wrote less of law and more of the way the light looked in the glasshouses in late afternoon, and of a child who had run shrieking happily when rain hit the panes for the first time and made a drum, and of the look a smith had made at his daughter when she sat to write her own name and signed it with a flourish he could not have taught her. Jon did not write but once, and the letter said only, "We found a valley and named it nothing, and there is a boy who throws a stick better than me now. 𝒂𝒔𝒕𝒆𝒏. And below, messily, Tormund had scrawled, He lies, the boy throws like a drunk goat, but do not tell him I said it. He is softer now and I like him better for it." Arya laughed and folded the paper and felt that a wall had been moved back in her chest to make more room for something she had mistaken for a heart's reluctant housekeeping. One spring, when the currents thought they were cleverer than the moon and the moon was too dignified to argue, Arya brought her ship onto a tidal flat that winked like a lizard's eye. Men jumped into the suck of it with grunts and lines. She waited for the pull to cease its tugging and then went across mud so honest it gleamed. On the other side, the land lifted into a low, shrugged shoulder of hills. She climbed one shorter than her attention span and then another longer than it had any right to be. On the crest she found, set into a tor as tidy as a lord's pet terrier, a ring of stones not unlike the ones in the song place long ago. These had faces, not human, something with a long memory of edges where bodies are soft. The eyes were not eyes but inward curves. The mouths were lines that declined speech politely. She stood there with her hands quiet and listened hard enough to make herself dizzy. She heard wind and a cricket with an unreasonable ambition, and she heard her own blood say yes and no at the same time in alternating beats. She said Bran's name into the clear and felt nothing and then everything. A raven far away turned on a column of hot air, and she turned with it and saw the ship and the shapes of men, and the long line of tides scolded for being late. She shut her eyes against the vertigo and opened them again and laughed aloud, silly with gratitude and annoyance both. "Not a toy," she said to no one, and sat down with her back against a warm stone and ate a pear Sansa would have called imperfect and Arya would call generous. She thought then, not for the first time, about turning the prow east and making a way back. She imagined the smell of Winterfell, the kitchen smoke, the iron in the air, the old dog who slept in the doorway and did not trouble to rise for queens, only for stew. She imagined walking under the boughs with Sansa and saying nothing for a very long time and letting the silence do the job words often ruin. She imagined Jon's grin poorly hidden and the awkwardness that would be both a treasure and a barrier. She imagined the bells and the square and Tyrion pretending not to watch her from behind a column so she could pretend not to see him. She imagined Brienne's nod. She imagined Ghost with his head tilted so she could put both hands into his ruff and lose them. She imagined a feast she would not stay for the whole of, because she has never liked rooms where wine chooses the conversations after the second bowl. She did not go. She went back to the ship with her body full of the good ache of a long climb and her mind quiet, and she put her hands on the rail and the salt into her lungs and told the captain, "South." to where the water warms and the fish are too pretty and too fast. He nodded without comment because he had learned she was as reliable as a wind that had decided to be kind and as unpredictable as a wind that had not. Years made their arrangements. King's Landing grew into the shape of a city that has been taught humility by fire and instructed in decency by loss. It acquired a habit of not burning. Its people learned the efficiency of affection. They were kind when kindness cost a penny and shrewd when kindness cost a pound, and the result was a place you could raise a child without teaching them to duck too early. Tyrion went bald not from worry, but because his hair had decided to leave and make room for the excellent shape of his skull. He accepted compliments from women and men with the same polite surprise. Bronn outlived 2 respectable men and 3 men who had bought respect with bad coin and died satisfied that his house had burnished its own arms with laughter. Davos lost count of the fairies and found himself in possession of a conscience that could locate a leak in a man as easily as in a boat and patched both as matter-of-factly. Sam fell asleep over a book and woke with a little girl's blanket tucked over his knees and did not move for fear of making her think her affection unwelcome. In the north, the glass gardens caught winter and held it between glass and seed and returned spring to women who had thought words like salad a fool's dream. They built a little hall near one with benches and chalkboards, and boys and girls both made figures on them with tongues peeking out in concentration, and grandfathers cried quietly with their backs very straight. Sansa leaned her cheek to one warm pane on a day when the wind outside had a knife in every finger and felt it cool. She laughed and did not say why. A woman near her pretended not to notice the queen laughing to her own shoulder and was proud she had the dignity to pretend. Beyond the wall, there came a winter that was not the kind that brings monsters. Those had been killed with a precision most songs have failed to turn into music, but the kind that reminds men the world is not an invention of theirs. They lost a man to cold because he refused a second blanket out of stubbornness. They did not beat themselves with grief. They learned and put 2 blankets on children without asking. Jon sat with Tormund and drank something so strong it straightened his hair and listened to a man who had a story about a bear who wanted to learn manners. He smiled and did not say, "Some men never will." He stood, later, with Ghost and listened to the deep silence of snow when it falls thick and isn't ready yet to be walked on, and felt the contentment that comes only when a man has chosen exactly what is happening to him. And west, always west. There came a day when Arya stood on a beach made of stones that had been smoothed by such a patience she felt ashamed of all her neat tricks. Before her rose cliffs that wore green like jewelry, and somewhere far within the cliff, a sound like a heartbeat kept its slow truth. The people she found there had hair braided up and pinned with bones so fine they looked like threads. They painted their hands before feasts with juice that stained them blue and pressed them to each other's cheeks in greeting. They had a way of walking with their feet very aware of what they were stepping on, and when she asked, they laughed and said, "There are things that bite." She looked down and saw a crab no bigger than her thumb regard her like a neighbor she had not said hello to yet, and said hello and laughed at herself, and the people decided to like her. They told her stories that had learned to be short. There was one about a woman who had sailed here long ago and had not died because death was busy elsewhere. She had taught them a way to mend weirs with a knot that did not know how to come undone. There was one about a child born with a white streak in his hair who had gone into the cliffs and come out with a song that made birds do what you wanted with their heads, though their bodies laughed at it and did what they wanted anyway. There was one about a man who had found a stone with a hole in it and had looked through and seen both the face he had been given and the one he had earned and had decided to wear both. Arya listened until the listening made a shape more interesting than the stories, and then she told one. About a girl who had been given a list and had learned to live without it, about a wolf and a hall and a face that was hers and not hers, and how you can be many people without lying. They were correct in their response. They fed her and then left her alone to sleep, and then came back and asked, without asking, for another, and she obliged and never once turned her story into a sermon. The girl who threw a knife once and hit the post and on her second try hit the post again and cried with rage asked Arya to show her the trick, and Arya did. Not because knives will keep you alive longer than trust, but because trust often arrives disguised as competence. She woke there one morning to the sound of rain that had been asked to work hard and had agreed. The sound came in sheets, then in beads, then back in sheets. The roofs shrugged and took it. The streams fattened and then reconsidered and spat some back so the land would not drown. The people did not hurry. She learned their names for 11 kinds of rain and told them the north had names too. and they laughed when they realized they were the same names under different clouds. Good rain mean rain, sideways rain, the rain that seems to be full of small fish because it hits you so, the rain that pats your cheek, the rain that bullies the roof and loses. Seemed a good day to make a choice. She walked to the cliff where the sound like a heartbeat was and found the place where the rock had been asked to give and had answered. A cave, but not. A big mouth with teeth of stone and breath of old salt. She went in a little way and let her eyes adjust and saw the a little sparkle where a vein of something had been tucked in there like a secret. She did not break it. She put her hand on cold and felt her own warmth press back like an equal. She thought of home and of the sea and of the truth that neither is a place only. They are habits of the chest. She said aloud to see if the echo would be interested. I will go east again someday when my feet want different floors. The cave took it and did not return it, which is an answer of sorts. She came out into rain that had decided to be done with passion and make a lens of itself. The world was sharper. Her ship tugged at its anchor like a dog told to stay in a yard during a festival. The boy, no longer a boy if you asked his shoulders, looked at her and did not ask anything. She smiled and shook her head and he nodded, understanding that not asking is a form of love. They sailed again because that is what ships do and what Arya had become. And in sailing, in the work and the weather and the small, insistent domestic acts that make a large thing pointed in a single direction behave, she found she was not running and not chasing. She was simply underway. In the north, children who had never seen a city grew into men and women who told each other stories that had nothing to do with fire-eyed corpses. In King's Landing, the bells were rung not to summon surrender, but to mark a marriage where both people had written their own vows badly and charmingly. In Noth, a crop failed and no one starved because a soldier had taught a farmer a way to save seed in jars buried just so. In a hall of books, Sam placed a volume with careful hands on a shelf and smiled at the thought of some child who would find it in 50 years and take it down and say, "What nonsense," and then read it all the way to the end and be less lonely for the company of its nonsense. And west of west, there was an evening when the air went still as a cat considering a jump and the sea lay like a thought too heavy to lift. And Arya stood in that hush and thought of a face she had once worn to walk through a city that had swallowed children and of a list she had once said to herself as a prayer with teeth. She thought of a queen she had killed and a dragon who had spared her and a brother who had saved the world and had not taken the bow for it and a sister who had taken a crown and made of it a farm tool. She thought of herself, which was once the hardest thing. She put her hand on the rail, this old, reliable marriage of tree and tar, and looked where the sun had made a road. She did not expect anyone to be coming down it. She did not expect a house with a red door at the end. She expected only more road. She smiled and felt how the body makes its own weather when it chooses. Night rose. The ship creaked like an old woman settling her bones and then kept her peace. The stars did their patient, stubborn work of staying. The boy snored and stopped and snored again. The captain gummed his pipe and had an argument with a smear of cloud and lost. The sea made the low song it sings when it has decided not to complain for a while. A fish leapt and fell back and decided it had been enough. In another world, a girl would have gone home and stood under a tree that bled and told it she had finished. In this one, Arya kept walking the rooms of a map that had never belonged to any of them and was generous enough to allow the feet of strangers anyway. She would go east when she was ready. She would go north when the smell of snow tugged at some old string in her ribs. She would go south if it amused her, and it might. She would not make promises to a horizon that had its own plans. She would keep her knives sharp and her laughter available and her hands good at ordinary things. She would remember to choose decent stew over the kind you make when you want to be someone else. She would write no lists. She would ring no bells except for joy. And this is how the story kept itself from ending. By refusing to close the door behind any of them. The wolf slept. The queen wrote her name and then others. The hand signed petitions for light. The soldier set down his spear and picked it up when needed and learned which was which. The ship leaned into wind. The sea breathed. Somewhere, in a city that had learned to be kind, a child ran without watching her feet and did not fall, and that was the sum of 1,000 decisions made just well enough. When the morning came, and it always does for the living, the horizon had moved as it always does for everyone, and Arya was there to meet it, as she always had been, and her shadow lay long and narrow along the deck like a road back and a road forward at once. She did not stand between them as if forced to choose. She stood on both, which is how you live if you are lucky, and if you are not, if luck runs short as it will. Then at least you know what to call the thing that keeps the light on your face and the salt in your blood. A name you earned not with crowns or songs, but with the resource most rare and most fairly spent: a life.